The Cold War never came to be a contest of armies and weapons, but a test of endurance, with pressure on the economy cracking an empire just as surely as any missile. The Soviet Union, stretched to its limit by decades of military appropriations, economic mismanagement and growing unrest began slowly crumbling under its weight, its cracks in the Iron Curtain widening from tiny fissures to wide splits year after year. Change was bound to come by the late 1980s. If political reforms like Glasnost and Perestroika aimed at reviving the Soviet system, they opened up its vulnerabilities. In Eastern Europe, voices long suppressed against the Moscow stranglehold began to grow louder, and that once unbreakable stranglehold started slipping. The impossible seemed to be in the offing. One after the other, Soviet satellite states began breaking free. The world watched in awe. Was the downfall of the Soviet Union inevitable, or was it merely a product of a series of decisions, mistakes, and misjudgments that made an end to an era inevitable? The Soviet Union is suffering from increasingly acute economic problems as stagnation, debt, and resource depletion undermine its foundation. Decades of central planning result in inefficiencies as industries fail to innovate and productivity declines. The cost of maintaining a world presence, subsidizing satellite states, and participating in the arms race becomes unsustainable for the economy. When shortages become rampant, discontent spreads among citizens, and confidence in the system begins to erode. Political instability increases with corruption creeping into the government machinery. Debates over leadership and ineffective reforms do not improve the severely deteriorating situation. The satellite states were frustrated with Soviet control, and their protests and demands for independence increased. The Eastern European countries, once held tightly under the influence of the USSR, started demanding autonomy. The growing resistance movements make it difficult for the leaders to suppress the rising turbulence. The Soviet-Afghan War accelerates the decline further. The long drawn-out war drains the country's financial resources and demoralizes the military. Soldiers return disillusioned, and the failure of the war weakens the USSR's image of invincibility. The cost of warfare, economic decline, and political turmoil combine to create a perfect storm. As the cracks in the system widen, the once mighty Soviet Union stands on the brink of collapse. Mikhail Gorbachev introduces sweeping reforms to address the Soviet Union's deepening crisis. Glasnost, or openness, allows for greater political discussion and press freedom, breaking decades of state-controlled narratives. Citizens, once silenced by censorship, begin openly criticizing government failures, corruption, and economic mismanagement. Previously suppressed truths about historical atrocities and systemic flaws come to light, eroding public trust in the Soviet regime. Instead of reviving the state, Glasnost accelerates its disintegration as people lose their fear of speaking against their leaders. At the same time, the Perestroika, or restructuring attempts to revitalize the ailing economy. Gorbachev introduced market-like reforms whereby some businesses would be allowed freedom and less interference from the central government. But decades of stiff state planning render the transition disorganized. Production slows down, the supply chains collapse, and inflation rises high. Instead of prosperity, Perestroika deepens economic instability. Worsening shortages and deteriorating living conditions turned frustration into unrest. These reform efforts were intended to salvage the USSR and let loose forces that no one had imagined or planned would fall under the jurisdiction of the center. The republics began acting increasingly as nation-states, wanting independence for themselves. The movement for nationalistic independence gains its strength. Strikes and protests flood the nation. Political opposition develops. As such, freedom begets lesser proclivities toward slipping back into oppression. From being a project for modernization in itself, the cause of the Soviet Union's defeat begins. The state loses its grip, and the once almighty superpower begins to disintegrate, not at the hands of foreign pressure, but from within. The issue is not whether the USSR can be reformed, but if it can even survive. East and West Berlin stand as an actual symbol of the Cold War, where this city is bisected by two opposing ideologies: capitalism on the west and communist rule on the east. To the west is huge economic prosperity, state-of-the-art infrastructures, and greater personal freedom. On the other hand, to the east, under communism, life would be characterized by economic stagnation, surveillance, and travel restricted. The Berlin Wall, built in 1961, was used both as an actual and emotional barrier to not allow East Germans to escape and cross west to this more fertile land. By the end of the late 1980s, desperation in East Germany finally reached the boiling point. Citizens, with economic hardship and government repression already at a peak, begin mobilizing massive demonstrations. Emboldened by reforms in the Soviet Union and seemingly unstoppable democratic uprisings around Eastern Europe, hundreds of thousands fill the streets. Calls for liberty become stronger and tougher on the regime in East Germany. On November 9, 1989, one piece of news made everything different. Under pressure to ease travel restrictions, a government official blurts out the news that East Berliners are now free to cross the border. Confused yet eager crowds gather at checkpoints, demanding entry into West Berlin. Border guards, uncertain of what to do, had received no clear orders, and when no resistance was forthcoming, the first people pushed past the gates. Thousands pour through within hours, scaling the wall, embracing loved ones, and chiseling away at the structure that has separated them for nearly 3 decades. The fall of the Berlin Wall is now a historical moment that is decided. It denotes not only union in a city, but also the dying out of communist rule in Eastern Europe. The world is holding its breath as the iron grip of the Cold War begins to loosen, leaving only one question when a wall crumbles. What's left? The power that constructed it? It is impossible not to notice that the Soviet foundation had cracks that cannot be overlooked by the late 1980s. Stagnation of the economy and political dissatisfaction go hand in hand with growing nationalist movements across the Eastern Bloc to signal an inevitable collapse. Inspiring policies by Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev in openness and restructuring pushed countries in this region, including Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, towards some form of free elections. Protest masses erupt. One by one, communist states crumble, people reject control by the USSR and demand democracy. Soon the mighty Eastern Bloc fractures and breaks its ties with the Soviet Union, which had tightened its grip strongly. Feeling the weakening might of the authority of the Soviets, hardliner communists who were within the USSR tried their best to override the situation of the Soviet situation. In 1991, in August, these officials, antagonistic to reformist Gorbachev, led a coup meant to reinstitute strict Soviet power. Tanks roll into Moscow, and Gorbachev is placed under house arrest. But the coup plotters had not reckoned with the Soviet people's outright defiance. Thousands took to the streets in protest, led by Russian President Boris Yeltsin, who climbed atop a tank to make a speech against resistance. Within days, the coup was falling and would seal the last chapter of the disintegration of the Soviet Union. By the end of the year, it would happen for sure. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned from the presidency of the USSR officially. That evening, the Soviet flag was hoisted for the final time on the Kremlin building, and then replaced with the Russian tricolor. The former superpower, once strong, had long been standing as the United States' strongest competitor, would come to its demise. The Cold War ends not in a nuclear standoff, but quiet dissolution of the empire. But what rises when the giant falls? The Soviet Union collapses, and does the world ever really emerge from its shadow? The global power structure reshapes itself. The United States remains the sole superpower, and other world powers and rising powers now can't compete with it. American influence leans on no direct competitor and rapidly changes international policies, economies, and military strategies. NATO is still a well-established force. However, the world is witnessing new alliances as nations are learning to live in a world where there is no polarized power struggle. Russia, once the heart of a great empire, stumbles to redefine itself in a world that is no longer under its control. The economic transition for the former Soviet republics is brutal. Countries that were once ruled by centralized planning must now learn to operate within free markets, privatization, and foreign investment. Inflation skyrockets, unemployment climbs, and corruption flourishes as oligarchs appropriate key industries. Some states, such as the Baltic nations, integrate well into the European economy, while others, such as Ukraine and Belarus, suffer through political instability and economic disaster. The Russian Federation itself suffers through a deep financial crisis, leaving millions in poverty. Does the Cold War end or merely disguise itself? As the ideological conflict between communism and capitalism gives way to its silence, new tensions arise. NATO expands its push eastward into erstwhile Soviet states, leaving Russia sorely displeased. Middle East conflicts, economic competition with China, and cyber warfare redefine the global competition. New leadership in Russia seeks means to once again reposition Moscow to shake up the order of the West. The Soviet Union disappears, but does the fight for dominance ever really end? Global politics donned the toga of the Cold War for years, however not through the route of military clashes, but through Cold Wars and an economic form of warfare plus a proxy form. Just from arms to space and the Marshall Plan, the world can see the rise and fall of such influence. Seeking that is manifested in the formation and breakage of alliances to shape international relationships into what looked like a policy on various economies that emerged. End. It is only recently that most believe the Cold War has finally met its end following the Soviets crumbling. So, was this ever a valid statement? Between communism and capitalism, all such battles disappeared with thin air as new games unfolded. NATO expansions, economic contests, and all sorts of interferences from countries in their fellow countries are never ending, a game well established a long time back. The only difference is guns. The game itself remains the same. So, as we look at the world today with economic wars, political tensions, and a new race for technological dominance, one question lingers. Does history ever truly stop repeating itself?